Hello and welcome to Coffee House Shots, the Spectator's daily politics podcast. I'm Katy Balls and I'm joined by Fraser Nelson and James Heale. And today has been the launch of the Reform Party's manifesto. James, who you've written about for Coffee House, can you just talk listeners through what the main announcements are?
Sure. So this is Reform's contract with Britain. They're insisting it's not a manifesto because, according to Farage, manifesto is now synonymous in voters' minds with lie. So they were very insistent on that. But it was a 24-page document they set out, really. And the irony, of course, was that the launch was in South Wales, and Farage stood up and said this was because he wanted to highlight Labour's failings within government, but actually the policies were all really directed at Tory voters, and in particular those 2019 Conservative voters who backed Boris Johnson's Brexit coalition. So really it involves about £150 billion worth of savings, so that involves things like a new immigration tax on people coming to this country to work here, also things like, for instance, abolishing half of the foreign aid budget, that's £6 billion right there, and it's a kind of mix of kind of classic Tory areas on things like tax cuts. I think 88 billion were laid out in this document, as well as other things like patriotic education in primary and secondary schools, so lots of red meat. And I think that, and the questions afterwards, Nigel Farage was asked about the fact that, this is supposed to be about Labour and Labour's record. Why then does all this aimed at the Tories? And he used the example of Lee Anderson as a former Labour MP and voter who'd supported that party. But I think that's the key point, is that these are kind of 2019 Tory voters who were previously Labour, rather than kind of first-time Labour people who are now switching to Reform. So that's the big difference. It's really eating into the Conservative coalition.
And what about the ECHR?
Even the ECHR immediately, according to their manifesto, and some pretty hardline stuff on things like, sending asylum seekers back into France. So a very hard-hitting policy issue on one of Rishi Sunak's big weaknesses.
Fraser, is this Nigel Farage outflanking Rishi Sunak to the right?
I don't really think so. One of my great tests when I saw this Reform UK manifesto was trying to work out what sort of party is this? Can this be described as radical right or populist right? Or how many of these policies can you imagine, for example, that no Tory candidates in the coming leadership campaign would be mentioning? And all of them do seem to be basic mainstream conservatism. Of course, a few of slightly more ambitious things you might not believe. But let's take leaving the ECHR. Right? Of course, that's radical, etc. But it's no more than Rishi Sunak himself has said he'd like to do. Let's take abolishing the net zero pledge. Well, Sunak has moderated the net zero commitment, and there are certainly many conservatives. You can certainly see, for example, that whoever the next leader of the Tory party is, they might abandon net zero. So all of these things matter to answer, to me, the big question right now. What's happening in this general election? Are we really seeing a collapse of the right? Is the right really collapsing in Britain when it's doing so well in the rest of Europe? I see a slightly different pattern here. I think that we're seeing two conservative parties. The Tories are one, Reform UK are the other. Now, the Conservatives are offering effectively conservatives without conservatism, and the Reform are offering conservatism without conservatives. If you capital C, small c, you get the idea here. But they're offering the same sort of thing. Reform's saying, look, I'll give you the Conservative agenda, but there won't be any of these Tories that you don't like. And the Tories, or the manifesto, is saying, look, we promise we'll do all these things, but to be honest, we've had 14 years where we haven't done them, and you don't really trust us right now. But it is the same. You can easily see the voters for these parties. They, as Belinda Carlisle might put it, dream the same dream and want the same thing. So you've got a situation where Labour is on, 42% of the vote, which isn't huge. It's about where Starmer was last September. He isn't really soaring away in public support, but we are seeing the right split into two fairly even chunks. As a result, Labour are heading for a big majority.
What is more credible, James? The Reform's manifesto, which is bolder in terms of its ideas, I think, than the Tory manifesto is, but a Reform party that, according to one LP on a really good night, could have 7 MPs, or the Tory manifesto, which probably is more achievable in reality, but of course they have the weight of 14 years in government.
Yeah, I think both are going to struggle in terms of credibility in the eyes of voters. I mean, for me, the question for Reform's manifesto is the markets, of course, given how much Liz Truss struggled with 20 billion of tax cuts and the associated spending cut programme. How much worse would this programme, involving, I think, 6 or 7 times that figure, actually play out in the markets, particularly given the plans for also the Bank of England loans as well. So I think that's something that's key. I think
it's also worth, James, it's listing how many things here are out and out unachievable, as we know. There's no way the markets, no way would ever ever lend any government that amount of money, as Farage says, there's no way any government can get to net zero immigration. It just isn't possible. I mean, so many countries would like to try that. So I think the other thing is, if you can't, I suppose you obviously, these guys would be lucky to get so much as 6 MPs, let alone to win government. So what we see here is a kind of like things we were promised that we know we would never be able to deliver. No government could be able to deliver. So in a strange way, I can see why he's not calling it manifesto, because it simply isn't deliverable.
And this was very much in the questions and answers. The first thing he was asked was, hang on a sec, this is more of a wish list than an actual manifesto. And he said, well, we're not going for government. We're not going to be in government this time. Labour have won this. It's next time. So the idea being that you sort of promise the world this time to improve your position for next time, we can actually be a credible opposition and a credible government.
So it's more sort of saying what direction we would like to go in. I mean, wouldn't we all like to be doubling GDP and etc., etc., which is why I think he's not really even pretending to be taken seriously on this. He's saying these are the sort of things which we believe, and if you like them too, as a protest, vote for us, because we are obviously a party of protest, which is why we cannot even pretend to be offering a manifesto.
Well, this is what is very much the Farage move. If you look at past manifestos, for instance, when he came back after 2010, and there was this ridiculous UKIP manifesto, would have things like traditional bus uniforms in the circle line, making it into a circle again, all these different really long UKIP policy manifesto, and Farage junked all that. And you saw him when he did his Radio 4 interview last week, I think. He was just straight away just ditching different policies here and there. And I think that's basically, he's a policy-like guy. He only has 2 or 3 big-ticket items and attaches his whole brand around that. And it's worked for him to this date. It's going to work in kind of destroying the Tories. The question is, can you then make that big pivot into a kind of actual one of the 2-3 main policies of government?
And Fraser, do you think it will work in destroying the Tories? James just said it would. I mean, do you think that the Tories are going to have a really hard time? As you say, this is a protest party that doesn't need to really get bogged down in the details. In a way, probably attacking them on the detail. It's going to be a pretty much, lacking impacts or doing what, critics would like to do with it. Do you think the Tories have much of a chance over the next 2.5 weeks in compressing that vote?
Well, let's remember, of course, the voting has already started. Some postal votes are already going in now, which is why when we talk about, there's X many weeks to go for campaign, yes, that may well be, but a lot of people have already cast their vote and will continue to do so in the next coming days and weeks. So yes, I do think it's too late for the Tories. The question is, will Farage destroy them? There's a reasonable chance that he might. The only thing he can do in this campaign is destroy the Tories. He can't achieve anything, he can't build anything for himself. This is why I think he might struggle in the end, because even if you do sympathise with his aims, if you think through how the Westminster system works, you will work out that all you can really do by voting reform is to add to Keir Starmer's majority, which is presumably the opposite of what you want if you're a right-wing voter. So how many people want to send a message to the Tories at the expense of, even if it means making the Labour Party stronger? Now, I think voters do tend to be quite sophisticated in this country. There's a lot of tactical voting. It could well be that the dominant emotion here is, look, we don't care what the consequences are. The Tories have annoyed us so much that off they go and they are destroyed. It's quite plausible. Right now, I wouldn't want to put a floor on the number of Tory MPs there might be after the next election. But is Farage capable of turning a defeat into something that will mean, for example, Keir Starmer's in power or Labour's in power for more like 10 to 15 years than 5 years? That will be the Farage effect. Is he capable of it? Absolutely.
I think 2 reasons to think perhaps why reform is now eating its Conservative vote much more. One is anecdote, one is data. On the anecdote, I'm hearing a lot more about reform coming up more on the doorstep than it was even 2 weeks ago, when some Tory MPs are expressing a lot of kind of scepticism about all of this.
Since the Farage return.
Absolutely, and the D-Day incident as well, of course. And I think the other point is on data. We've got a new poll out today by Gel Partners, probably the most favourable to the Tories we've seen to date, and that's only has reform 5 points behind the Conservatives on 18 points versus 23 for the Tories. So I think right now the direction of travel is there's no sign that kind of vote that vote which the reform have built up is going to go down anytime soon.
Thank you, Fraser. Thank you, James, and thank you for listening.